to the final session of Fair Games Group of 4 workshops. Just to explain what we're trying to do is we're basically set ourselves the lovely, lofty ambition of trying to change the future of football in the UK. And with that, we've been bringing together some of the great minds of football with some great ideas and some presentations as well. And then we have a number of clubs also on board. So at the moment, we're up to 13 clubs. I'm optimistic in my mind that that may actually grow today. So I know that we've got 2 or 3 other clubs that may come on during today's session and actually maybe later on tonight as well. So that's my optimistic world. So what we've been doing is, on top of that, we've been grabbing all these academics and we'll be looking to try and get some proper realistic solutions to the issues in football as we know it. Over the next few days, we will be meeting with a range of politicians as we try and take some of these solutions to the next level. Our ultimate goal is to make sure that Tracy Crouch's review doesn't sit on as a dusty shelf at the end of it and becomes something that's meaningful, that transforms football into the sustainable future that I think we all really want to see. So tomorrow we'll be talking to Alison McGovern, and then on Monday is the long-awaited meeting with Tracy Crouch, which is the person who's leading the fan-led review. And so we have our own particular session for Fair Game clubs where we'll be doing that, and that's quite exciting to look forward to. And then later on we have meetings with Andy Burnham, and we'll be doing a big launch event at the House of Commons on the 1st of July with some of our MPs and politicians who have come on board. It's been a fantastic journey. It's been an absolute pleasure to lead all these groups of people and bring them all together. I do now firmly believe that we're on a good path towards delivering long-term realistic change. In the morning, we've got two interesting presentations coming through from Greg and Rodoika, who'll be looking at their kind of principles about what they're trying to achieve. And that'll be followed by another session with a presentation from the esteemed academic Robert Wilson, who's looked at this area in depth as well. And Rob, I'm hopefully that you're blushing on the back. I've just called you esteemed, and that's the plan. And then that will go on until 11:15. We'll have a short break, and then there's a brilliant panel at 11:30 to 12:30 with being chaired by Barry FC's and ex-EFL person Darren Bernstein, with David Goldblatt, Christine Philippou, Dave Boyle, and Nigel Clibbins, who is the CEO of Carlisle United. So that should be an absolutely great panel as well. And then we break at 12:30. That's where we're up to today. Before I go much further, it would feel always remiss of me not to introduce John Scales, our ambassador, to talk a little bit about his experience and where he's up to with stuff. And John's been brilliant at reaching out to a whole range of people over the last few days. I've probably played him, and we've been exchanging text messages and phone calls throughout the last few weeks non-stop, and John's been a huge support. John, just over your thoughts and your views on where we're up to. John.
Yeah, morning everybody. This journey started not that long ago, and it's incredible how far we've come. We've been very, very fortunate and privileged to have so many people join in and offer their expertise on behalf of the clubs, working with the clubs. It's been sort of quite inspiring in so many ways. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank everybody. It's the 4th of our panels, of our workshops, and they have just had the most incredible energy and focus and attention to really everybody collectively coming together to make a difference within the game. And I think across, there's been no great egos. It's just been everybody working together, which is quite inspiring. That, you know, we talk about football, how everybody operates in their little silos, and it's difficult to break out of that. But actually what we've shown with and seen with Fair Game is everybody really come together as this community of football and the lovers of the game that really want to make significant changes and differences within the game for the better. So I pay homage to everybody that's been part of that. And from my perspective as a former player, I was absolutely delighted to come on board. I wasn't quite sure where things would go, but it's been very inspiring. So well done to everybody. There's still obviously lots to do. These panels, you know, when we move into the afternoon sessions and suddenly we have the breakout rooms and we discuss actually from the morning what solutions are practical and achievable. what are workable solutions that can be put forward and be adopted and a consensus reached. We're making great progress on those moves. So again, it's well done to everybody, and collectively we all come together for the common good. So I'm looking forward to this morning. It should be a great panel. So welcome to everybody. Sit back and listen in and enjoy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. And obviously, just to warn, give people that it is being recorded, and actually we're live streaming today, which is the first for us. So you can see it live on YouTube, which means all the little kind of mistakes I've made earlier on, I'm now completely regretting. Anything I may have said that hopefully was all clear. So that's where we are. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over slightly early just to Greg and Regulator to talk through their findings and introduce themselves, and then we'll come to Rob later on. I'll be turning my camera off for this bit so that you don't have to see me, and hopefully we can enjoy that. We'll get a chance to ask a few questions in the chat that I'll be screening later on as well. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you. Thanks. Greg, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, thanks, Red. Yes, good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here. Greg Campbell, I'm a partner at Campbell to Kell. We are we describe ourselves as a multidisciplinary management consultancy working all over the country with particular specialism in particular sectors, including sports, but in terms of areas on which we concentrate, strategy, regulation, governance are areas in which we've got, I think it's fair to say, a reasonable amount of expertise. Brad.
Hi, and I'm also a partner at Campbell to Kell. I've been there for nearly 15 years, I think, and both Greg and I have served on different not-for-profit boards in the past, and I was recently a commissioner for the Haringey Fairness Commission. So, Greg, can we pop up the slides, and we'll just, we won't entertain you with details of our football affiliations, but suffice to say that Greg's nearly always depressed about the prospects of his club.
So bear with me while I get the right screen up. Right. Can you see one slide?
I can. If you can move to the next one, that would be great. So I won't repeat Greg's intro, but just to kind of emphasise the point that our work is often in with regulators, in the field of governance, with boards, trying to ensure good standards and practice, and that we're both kind of theoreticians in that. We write codes of governance, we write advice, we look at things that go wrong in some sectors, but we're also pragmatists. We work with real organisations, trying to move them along a spectrum from sometimes being dysfunctional to better, or from good to great. And actually some of our work in communities and with young people is sometimes directly with grassroots people, so residents, beneficiaries, other stakeholders. So we work at the different ends of a kind of spectrum, if you like, in a particular sort of ecosystem. Next slide, please, Greg. We're all very familiar with some of the issues in football, and it's quite clear that self-regulation hasn't worked, isn't working. And in a way, what we're trying to advocate is a system which is fair, takes note and cognizance of stakeholder perspectives, addresses what can feel like a kind of monopolistic control of community organisations, if you like, and can also have a damaging impact on local communities. So why are we engaged in this? We're engaged in this. We're not trying to make money from it. We're engaged in it because we're passionate about football. We're passionate about communities and about stakeholders being properly engaged, and we have lots of experience of trying to help organisations do that. And we also think that there's a window of opportunity at the moment. So the emphasis for us is about collaboration, about really working with other organisations to try and push something over the line here. Next slide, please. Just in terms of sort of thinking about regulation in other sectors, I just make some points about the value of regulation, and probably this audience doesn't need lecturing about those, but you know, this is about building public trust and confidence. Many of the regulators in some of those sectors are there to ensure that the interests of the public are well served and will feel that sense of public duty. Some of them are there because they are trying to ensure that what can appear to be monopolistic frameworks still allow for some form of competition. So you have different kinds of economic regulators there, and they're usually about trying to ensure sort of fair access to a market or protection of sort of public assets. Regulators can contribute to society being fairer. They can promote learning from their practices. They can do bits of quantitative reporting and trends and kind of financial data, bits of good guidance and practice about stuff that goes wrong and how not to get there. So in a way, the question about why to regulate and why football may need a regulator, I think is self-evident that the public is not in a position to defend its own interests in this particular kind of ecosystem. So we feel that there's a compelling case for independent regulation. Next slide, please, Greg. So what makes regulation effective? The usual sort of commonality about regulators is their integrity through independence, and that's independence both from government in their operational decision making and independence from the bodies being regulated. And I think that that's a kind of significant differential with how sort of football operates at the moment. The independence is important because it's about avoiding undue influence. So there isn't kind of capture of a regulator. It's a way of capturing objective evidence so that the system has confidence in the fairness of decision making. Again, something that's missing from the football ecosystem at the moment. The risk-based proportionate approach is something that's very common across the kind of regulatory regimes of other regulators. So this is about trying to direct resources where they're going to have the most impact on outcomes. Things like evidence-based decision-making are about ensuring objectivity through due process and being very transparent about how the regulatory regime works. In terms of coercive power and direct influence, there are various reports that I've read in the past, sponsored by government that look at standards of public life and regulators and argue that they contribute to supporting a wider ethical environment. So there's a leadership opportunity and a responsibility to see compliance as some form of enlightened self-interest. It raises the bar for all of the players in an ecosystem. It has the power to change behaviours through engagement. And I would say that we as consultants over the last 20 years or so have seen that operate in other sectors, that introducing a kind of robust regulatory framework raises the bar on standards, raises the bar on sort of public confidence. Of course, there are other aspects that we'd expect from a kind of effective regulator around openness and public engagement. So they should keep a focus on meeting the public and consulting the public in different ways, or the relevant sort of public for a particular regulatory sort of sector. And of course, in terms of their own quality of governance, that will be influenced by how they approach things like diversity and inclusion, the kind of membership of the board, how they make public the workings of their own organisation. So you'll often see on regulators' websites access to their minutes, access to information, declaration of interest about the people sitting on the board. So these are important aspects of just underlining the integrity, independence of the regulator. And it feels like that cluster of things are really sort of missing from the kind of football circle at the moment. Next slide, please, Greg. This is the last slide from me. So of course, there needs to be some kind of legal powers for the regulator to have some teeth. In a way, we're trying to sort of be realistic about where the regulator starts. We all know that the pyramid system in football has about as much kind of fluidity and dynamism as the Eiffel Tower, I think, at the moment, in terms of how things operate. So this is about looking at the kind of upper echelons of football in the first instance. Of course, we would expect that a regulator would set a regulatory framework of some kind, and some of those frameworks can be very explicit about things around sort of financial expectations around financial sustainability and viability, and how regulated entities approach their kind of risk management. So and some of that is about concepts of protecting things that might be seen as kind of public assets in some kind. So we've seen that operate in the social housing sector, for example. We're proposing that there should be a comply or explain regime for regulation. So that's about not being too prescriptive about how organisations operate, but rather setting a set of outcomes or principles that they need to meet. And it's up to them to demonstrate the routes that they operate to meet those outcomes or principles, or where they haven't met them for some reason, actually having a responsibility in their annual reporting to explain why they haven't met them, what their route is towards meeting them, etc. Of course, across some of the regulators that we've worked with, they have the power to issue codes of conduct, bits of good practice and guidance, and that can be advisory. So that's not necessarily about the mandatory stuff. That's rather about trying to give you a kind of ladder to what good practice looks like, or how to meet some of the requirements. The powers to sanction probably need to be quite substantive in football, and that means that goes back to the regulator being able to regulate with a really strong evidence base about why they're intervening in some way, in any kind of way. And the right of appeal against regulatory decisions, again, goes back to those things around independence, around transparency. There needs to be a good, independent, transparent appeals process. Of course, we'd expect regulators, while the disposition is towards openness and transparency, there's always something about respecting commercial confidentiality and sensitivities. But that doesn't stop a regulator from taking a kind of helicopter aggregated view and issuing information and reports about what they see as common trends arising from some of the insight they have into the regulated entities. So over to you, Greg.
Thanks. Okay, so Radojka's been talking about the broad principles under which regulation needs to operate. What I'd like to touch on is some of what we see as the practical aspects of delivering regulation. Now, people need to be clear what they're being regulated against. Therefore, we believe that the regulator should put in place a number of regulatory standards, and the areas that those might cover are set up on this slide. What does effective governance look like in the professional football sector? What are the principles around club ownership, around organisations being financially viable, around how there should be engagement with the fans, what kind of involvement with communities, health and safety responsibilities at grounds, and so on. We're not necessarily suggesting that all of these areas, and there may well be one or two other areas that should be included in the standards. I mean, this is, what we've put up is a proposition for discussion to frame that aspect. We're not necessarily saying that all of these should be put in place on day one. And I'll touch on this in a moment. We need to be practical about what the regulator can do. Nonetheless, these are the sorts of areas we would expect the regulator to set up to put standards in place. And going back to what Radojka was talking about, comply or explain, the general principles around governance will be X, Y, Z. Tell us how you meet those standards. It's not about being absolutely prescriptive down to the letter of how organizations that can be wildly different in size, geographical area, focus, local priorities, and so on. They can be wildly different in terms of the way that they operate. How should the regulator operate? Our view would be that in line with effective regulation practice in other jurisdictions and in other countries, You need to have a board that's responsible for determining the overall strategy, direction, and policy of the organization. And you need to have an executive which is responsible for implementing the strategy. And the board then, if you like, monitors the effectiveness of the delivery of the strategy and comes back with revisions as necessary in key areas of policy in the light of that delivery. It isn't going to be cheap to set up a regulator. Certainly, if you take into account the scale of the organizations, or at least the financial weight of the organizations, particularly at the top of the game, where I think many of us would agree the abuses of the current arrangements are greatest. Those people are going to take a lot of regulating, and it isn't going to be cheap to put an effective regulator in place. There are two obvious sources. One is central government grant. The other is subscriptions or levies on the regulated entities. I know that there are some who will take the view that all of the funding should come from the regulated entities, the clubs, and so forth. That might work. It would certainly work from the point of view of the Treasury, but realistically, one needs to look at actual numbers. Public accountability is particularly important, and that will play out in different ways. I mean, Radojka has talked about examples on a sort of day-to-day, week-to-week basis where the regulator would be publishing minutes of meetings and so forth. But there needs to be a formal accountability process. This would be a regulator established by statute, by legislation at Parliament. It needs to be reporting to Parliament, but annually should be sufficient on the basis that there is going to be continuing reporting to DDCMS, Digital Culture, Media and Sport. There will need to be effective information sharing and liaison with other relevant regulators. I mean, this is sort of business regulators, tax regulators. Yes, there will be issues around confidentiality of information. Then there would need to be protocols around how information is shared. But the basic principle should be accepted that one regulator should have the ability to talk to another regulator that has a purview over aspects of what they're looking at. And we would also suggest that the regulator, in line with best principles and practical governance, if you like, should adopt service standards of its own, what it's going to deliver when, for example, how quickly it will respond to complaints.
Greg, I would just add something there that, of course, many regulators also do things like adopt the Nolan principles about openness, selflessness, etc. So those are sort of 7 standard principles of public life. And there are actually different fora for chairs of regulatory bodies, for example, to meet together from time to time to try and share practice about evolving kind of regulatory thinking. So just a little addendum.
Exactly, thank you. Moving on to the board and the executive, it ought to be axiomatic, but it often isn't, that the board should be made up of people who've got the skills required to do the job. They need to or collectively, they would need to understand how good governance works. They need to understand their role. They need to understand the entities that they are regulating. And it's appropriate that people are drawn from different places in order to ensure that. And diversity is an important principle. And there are different aspects to diversity. People should be bringing diversity of background. You know, one wouldn't want to see the usual bunch of white blokes in blazers that make up the regulator. One would expect a broader range of people, but also it's about diversity of views so that there is effective challenge and debate within the board around major and significant issues of policy and strategy. We would suggest that again, in line with best principles, what we would regard as best governance principles and best regulatory principles, board terms of office should be limited. I mean, we would suggest that people should be appointed for 3 years. with a max and able to serve a maximum of 6, and that would be it. We don't want people hanging around after their usefulness is perhaps lessened, and one wants to see a certain amount of churn so that there are new ideas, new experiences coming onto the board. It's important that the members of the board should not have formal links, certainly financial links. I mean, we're not talking about support, being supporters or season ticket holders. We're talking about earning money or earning substantial money from the key entities that they are responsible for regulating. We've set up an example membership of the board on this slide. We're suggesting a membership of about 9 would be an appropriate number. Not too many, not too few. Making sure that the key components are reflected in terms of those most directly affected by regulation. But people are coming from different constituencies. But having said that, people should be appointed to the board. They are not there as delegates. I don't believe that would be appropriate. I believe that an approach that sets members of the board up as delegates on behalf of particular constituencies would be inappropriate and would hamper the effective working of the board. They are there as members of the board, albeit drawn from different places. We would suggest that the chair should be one of the independents appointed by Parliament. I mean, there's a principle here about being seen to be, if you like, above the fray. And of course, the organisation, the regulator, needs to have an effective executive and staff team. Those should be appointed by those members of the executive should be appointed by the board following open public competition. We don't want the kind of backhanders, and I'll sort out my mate, that too often characterises these sort of appointments within individual clubs. And some final points before we shut up. This is a big deal. We all, I think, around the the different strands of the movement for independent football regulation, want to achieve a huge amount of change. We can see what's wrong, but we need to be realistic about how much can be achieved by the regulator alone, and how long it's going to take to achieve it. Because in some senses, we are looking to change the whole architecture of the way that the game is structured at club level and club ownership level. Phasing is likely to be particularly important. There are different ways that one could phase the introduction of regulation. I talked a minute ago about perhaps, for example, phasing the introduction of various of the standards. You start off with those that are judged as highest priority, and then you move on to the next batch. But there's other ways that phasing could be relevant. A regulator that is set up on day one to regulate, well, in the men's game, for example, all 92 clubs and the conference and the National League and so on, and similar levels in the women's game, is going to fall over because they're not going to be able to achieve everything. So there's different ways that phasing could be approached. Either you could start off by saying the standards that we've adopted apply to everybody, but we're only going to actively regulate them in the first instance on day one of the new regime coming into force for, let us say, the Premiership and the Championship. And a year later, they'll move on to the rest of the EFL and so on. The other approach, or a sort of variation on that, is to say regulation only applies at this level at this point, and it will move on to others. What I'm talking about is the difference between saying that the standards apply to everybody on day one, but we're not going to regulate them all immediately. Or you say the standards apply to this tier on day one, and to that following tier after 1 year, after 2 years, and so forth. It's important that there are reviews built into the regulator's journey. We've suggested that a review after 1 year and after 3 years, and those sort of reviews can be triggers for moving on to the next phasing. But it is particularly important that the regulator is not set up to fail. And of course, when the regulator goes live on day one, that doesn't mean that the standards are all going to be adopted on day one, and active regulation is going to take place. Day one, following parliamentary legislation, is going to be about recruiting the board and then moving on to recruit the executive, other members of staff, and then there's a training process, it's developing the standards. We all need to be practical about how long this is going to take. But at the same time, there will be quick wins. I don't necessarily have a shopping list in my back pocket at the moment. There will be quick wins that the regulator is able to deliver relatively straightforwardly, and it will be important to identify those at an early stage because of the weight of expectations. We want to keep everybody on side with this principle. Fans, clubs, politicians, local communities, and so on. We don't want them to lose heart, but we also don't want them to expect that everything is going to start immediately, that there's a magic button. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. That was very useful and very insightful. Obviously, if you could share those slides with us, then we'll be able to share it with the people and the who are on the call at the moment. I'll just say that I'm aware that there are 11 clubs currently listening in, who are all from Fair Game, and 1 or 2 that aren't from Fair Game. And it would be very interesting to get some questions or stuff through from them. So if people do have any questions and they want to put them in the chat, that would be useful. This is a chance to interrogate a little bit about what Greg and Rad have produced here, because obviously, we're looking at it from a club perspective. Equally, there are a number of other academics who have looked into this, so it'd be dead useful to develop that. We're very keen to get to a situation where we produce something that's robust and works for everybody. Greg, I was particularly impressed with that. On the just from my perspective, looking at that board structure where you've got those 9 people, how does that replicate what would happen on other regulatory bodies? And is that kind of a normal sort of number? And then also on top of that, the question obviously is about the government appointees, which I'm intrigued by, and I think it's a good thing, but how would you envisage that process working as well? So 2 questions on that, just basically looking at the how it reflects practice elsewhere.
Shall I start, Greg?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Because I would say there isn't necessarily a normal number on regulators. There's kind of differing practice. But what we do know about other bits of research about effective boards is that often between 8 and 12, and maybe at the lower end of that limit, sort of 10 and under, makes for a tighter dynamic in a boardroom. It means that there are no passengers, everyone is an active contributor, and there's sort of stronger interplay and dynamics between the people around the table. So the kind of size thing is in a way part of our kind of learned experience, but also it has a bit of research backing it up. But there isn't a singular number across regulators that says that's the right answer. Do you want to talk about the composition bit, Greg?
Yeah, the football or the regulation of football, at least certainly in terms of the present debate, is different from a lot of other regulators in the sense that there are a number of competing and some might say conflicting interests. Certainly the interests of the major clubs conflict with well, they conflict with other clubs, smaller clubs. They also conflict with the interests of the fans. And I think finding a mechanism that would allow those key interests to be represented on the board is quite important. I mean, you know, I'm sure in this gathering, it would be accepted that the fans should be there. But realistically, there should be views that reflect the experience of the clubs should be there. And can one reasonably leave out the players? I think probably not. But as far as the broader independents are concerned, the principle of being recognized as an independent body, and therefore having a core perhaps of members of the board who owe no allegiance to any community is an important one.
Thank you. We've got a few more questions just coming through on the chat that I'll just read out because not everybody can see all of those. So the question comes in, so who amongst existing regulators are good and who is not, and why?
I think that's quite difficult to answer. I mean, I think what influences the efficacy of a regulator is their regulatory powers. Probably what also influences them is the adequacy of their resources. So if you look at an organisation like the Charity Commission, you know, there are thousands of charities. How are you going to be an effective regulator of thousands of charities? You can't go around inspecting all of them. So there are different challenges for regulators in different sectors. But I think often what we see is after time, regulatory changes changing to give the regulator more powers of intervention or more powers of direction to an organisation, to a regulated entity. So part of it is about what their authority is under statute and what powers of intervention they have. I think the delegate on the board thing, I mean, it doesn't have to be, what one has to be careful about is this isn't a popularity contest, and that doesn't lead to effective governance. So it can't be that some sort of gobby person somewhere is the person who wants to be on the board, because sometimes the activists don't make the great strategists in a kind of board scenario or the great independent thinkers. But there is nothing to stop fans' bodies, for example, having access to a range of people who they might choose to appoint who aren't coming from the point of view of trying to be the fan voice, you know, explicitly the kind of representative, but are rather someone that they might publicly recognise as being a fantastic person to serve on the board of the regulator. So there are different ways to kind of look at the, if you like, the aspect of sort of stakeholder composition to try and mitigate that risk that you're not there to somehow feel like you can't possibly, it doesn't work actually. When governance tries to kind of conflate representation with sort of membership of a board, it invariably sort of goes wrong. So it's about making sure, it's a kind of reminder around the board table, if you like, that everyone around the board table needs to take seriously the kind of interests of fans and clubs.
We've got,
so that was David Goldblatt's question. I was trying ineptly to answer.
There are a number of other questions coming through. Just need to be a bit wary of time just because we've got Rob as well. So we'll try and get through the 4 questions that are in there now and see how we get on, and then we'll hand over to Rob. So the next question is from Mark Chapman. I'll read it out. Would you foresee that the new regulator would work alongside the FA, FL, Premier League, or replace one or all of those? Just to say, Mark is the vice chair of Luton Town Supporters Trust, just to give you a bit of background to Mark.
I would say that well, I think that we need to be clear about roles. The regulator is not there as the, if you like, a service delivery vehicle. The regulator is there to ensure that the way that the game works and the interrelationships between clubs, supporters, players, and so on and so forth operate effectively and, so far as possible, fairly. So I don't see I certainly don't see the regulator taking on the role of the FA, the EFL, the Premiership, or whatever. I would assume that those entities will continue. There might well be circumstances, and I think this would be an interesting area for debate, which I was thinking about the other night. Should the regulator actually have a regulatory role in respect of the FA, the Premiership, the EFL, and so on? Because I think they should. But there is a different dimension, because you're regulating not just the clubs, but also the broader entities, the competition entities that they're part of.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Dave Boyle's written a nice lengthy question in there, which basically I'll summarise, and I'm sure Dave will be fine when you're summarising this, to being that why can we not trust football to regulate itself at the moment, and also whether putting in a political process, whether that's actually legitimate, and whether there's not a risk connected with doing that, because obviously they've had the opportunity in the past and it hasn't really worked. So just whether you can address that one as well.
Well, let me give you 3 words: European Super League. These people cannot be, look, we know where the abuses are greatest. It's at the top of the Premiership, and with the entities with which a limited number of clubs engage. And there's but it goes beyond that. I mean, it's the relationship of the Premiership to the Championship and the EFL. It's issues around parachute payments, support for individual local clubs. How do we prevent more berries, for example? Leave it to United, City, Liverpool, Chelsea, Spurs and Arsenal and the Premiership. It's not going to happen. The European Super League was brought down by this collective howl of outrage, which was fantastic. In my own little way, I'd like to think I was part of it. This collective howl of outrage from fans and politicians recognizing which way the wind was blowing in this country and in other countries. And that reflects the level of dissatisfaction with the people who are in the positions of power and influence within the game. Decade after decade, year after year, they've demonstrated they can't be trusted. Self-regulation doesn't work. And as we were seeking to highlight, one of the areas we were seeking to highlight in the PowerPoint was it's been recognized that self-regulation does not work in a whole range of sectors. Football is just one of those. And I don't think we should shy away from it.
There's a great question here from Sam, who's part of the Fair Game Management team. And it's it's a tricky one, really. How do you get the right skills and diversity when you have majority elected members of the board?
So you can set out, this is our notional skills matrix for the board. This is how we view the skills, competencies, other lived experience, ideal, balance of kind of other protected characteristics. So people in applying to be on the board need to be clear about their fit with what it is that the board needs to be effective and functional. So if it's about setting out the needs of the board in the first instance. And people can only sort of put themselves forward if in some way they are answering the needs of that kind of matrix. That's the simple answer to that.
Thank you very much on that one. I'm going to answer one more question before we run too heavily into Richard's slot as well, but this has been really intriguing, and obviously it's the start of the conversation. So we will be looking at using your expertise going forward when we're developing solutions along with the clubs in the future. I'll come to a couple more questions. Any thoughts on how a regulator would balance differences between stakeholder interests, Ofcom, etc., have reference to economic theory, how would this work in the case of football? And that comes from Richard Evans from Birkbeck University.
I'm not sure what the reference to economic theory is, but I mean, regulators can do things. Economic regulators can sometimes do things around price capping, for example, which we see in the utilities sectors. So there are, and they can do things about licensing regimes and accreditation regimes of different kinds, access to a market. So there are ways in which economic interest can be brought into play in the field of regulation. So which stakeholder interests are we trying to balance? The interests of the regulated entities and the interests of the public. I would say that, actually we can see examples from organisations like Ofgem that are trying to balance exactly those sorts of interests. Is there kind of a fair market and fair competition for the regulated entities, at the same time are the interests of the public protected?
Okay, sorry, Greg, go on.
I mean, the principle of setting standards of what good governance would look like, what financial viability should look like, that we've suggested does fall very much to the regulator, and that would set up a range of, if you like, tests against which the actions of individual regulated parties, the clubs, can be assessed. But there's also the question of how the board is. It touches, I think, to some extent on how the board is structured, but also making sure that as part of that, you're reflecting a range of experiences, but you're not there as delegates, and you don't have as a board member, and you don't have an individual financial stake in one of the regulated entities.
I'm going to end with one last topical question before we go on to it, just because I'm aware that we're eating heavily into Rob's time, and it's just the last one, which is how do you handle the ESL, the issue of the ESL, a body that wouldn't act within the existing football framework? And actually also the other follow-up question to that, how would you stop an ESL?
I'm not going to pretend that we've got all the answers. We're just trying to do some. This is not a cop-out, but it is a serious point. There's a whole architecture that needs to be developed here. There are going to be all sorts of issues that need to be debated out there. But I would think that certainly we've said the regulator needs to have teeth. They need to be capable of applying sanctions. Those need to be real sanctions of different kinds. It could be a matter of preventing them from competing in particular competitions. It could be a matter of financial fines. I don't know yet, but it's the sort of question that will absolutely need to be addressed.
Well, I'm going to end. Sorry, Brad, do come in.
And I was going to say, I mean, there are great questions in the chat, and they're good things. Do send them to us afterwards, because they're good things for us to go away and think about how we answer. Because in a way, we've tried to punt something into a space to just help foment the debate. Help try and create a kind of atmosphere in which this is being discussed. And I think there's some meat for us to go away and think about that. So thank you, everyone who's been kind of probing and interrogating, because I'll go away and think about some of those things.
I mean, obviously, with the one thing with Fair Game is our big ambition is to make sure that these big questions do get answered, and we put the right people in the room to develop real, long-term, realistic solutions, and we interrogate all those things so that all the questions that need to be answered are answered, and that we can, come the appropriate time. Our aim is to try and have this all in place over the summer so that we can have really good, robust briefing papers for all of these issues, and that we've got good responses to all of them. So a big thanks to Greg and Rad. I can see one last new message. Just check if that's anything else. A realistic implementation timeline. Let's go with that question. I'll go to Richard. Robert, sorry. Greg, last question then. Realistic timeline. Greg?
I'm just thinking a year to get from the point of pressing the button. Okay, we go out and recruit the board. and the executive. And we have the first standards drafted. It might,
Okay.
but it might be 18 months.
Right, well, we'll push for a year. So my idea is that by October 2022, you've heard it here, we'll have a regulator in place and it will all be a happy world and all these things will be being dealt with. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Rad. Rob, apologies for running a little bit late, but huge thanks. I hope you understand that was quite an interesting conversation. Rob, I know that we've got some great slides coming through from you, and thank you so much for sparing the time to come and present some of your findings to us so we can all have a good listen. Rob, over to you.
My pleasure. Thanks, Niall.
You should probably introduce yourself as well, Rob. Just so
I will. I've got a little slide on that for us, so we can. Should be all right. So, Niall, I can still see you. Can you just give me a thumbs up that you can see the screen? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Okay. Listen, everybody. Thanks ever so much for inviting me along this morning. I've put together a slide deck for today. I haven't rehearsed it. It's fresh off the PowerPoint mill, if you like. So hopefully I'll try and keep this to time. And I was shamefully working through some of this while Greg and Radoika were talking. And what struck me in that last part of the discussion, certainly about the self-regulation point, is, as you'll see through some of these slides in a moment, self-regulation hasn't worked in a number of different industries. Football is no different to that. And I think, without overly simplifying that, it's because of the self-interest mentality that exists within football and this winner takes all scenario. So if you finish top of the league, you take everything. If you finish at the bottom of the league, obviously, you get relegated because of the open league structures that we use in European team sport, and particularly English football. And before I start, I just want to let you know my philosophy, if you like, and that is based broadly on economic theory, which is that uncertainty of outcome is absolutely critical to any sporting competition if it has genuine ambitions to generate revenue, and that uncertainty of outcome is organised or is underpinned by something that we call competitive balance. And what that essentially says is that when two teams come together, we have no idea what the result's going to be, and that uncertainty of the result outcome is what drives TV broadcasting, is what drives sponsorship, and of course is what drives matchday crowds. And the more you erode competitive balance, so there's more the opportunity to get really, really big clubs that become very, very dominant in respective leagues and competitions, the less attractive that will ultimately become. And we could argue for quite a while about the impact of the Big Six, the Big Eight in the Premier League, and the impact that they have throughout the system. But broadly speaking, it's just something I want you to hold on to as I run through over the next 15 minutes or so, and I will try and keep it to about 15 to 20 minutes. So Niall's asked me to talk to you today about the financial situation, the economic backdrop of English professional football. I will naturally focus a little bit on the Premier League because that is where the money really comes into the game. But then we'll look at Championship costs and revenues as a key case study, and I'll make reference to what the situation is in Leagues 1 and 2, so we can really put together the pyramid. It's worth saying at this point that whilst I'm presenting today, a lot of what you will see is research that's been conducted by both myself, but also one of my research associates, Dr. Dan Plumley, who's also part of the Fair Game initiative, and then my broader research team that I run at Sheffield Business School, which is based at Sheffield Hallam University. I've been working now in and around football for probably the best part of 2 decades now. I started as an undergraduate, probably had lofty ambitions to work within the professional game and to move into management administration at a club level, perhaps even up to chief executive level. But the more I got dragged into higher education, the more my career took that particular direction. And I was described the other day by one of my venture capital clients, actually, as the least academic that he knows. And I quite like that, because I don't see any point for academics to theorize, to provide really, really complex data and to generate statistical outcomes if that data and if those outcomes can't genuinely be implemented in the sectors that they profess to have an impact on. So a lot of the work I'm going to present to you today is work that we undertake at the university, but that we also connect with professional sports teams, particularly those that operate in professional football. And there will be a shameless call to action actually for everybody at the end of this session to support us with a research project that we've got. So broadly speaking, my research and the research of my research team fits into three broad buckets, if you like. Firstly, the financial analysis of professional teams. So how healthy are they? Where are the big issues? And that's what I'm going to focus on today, and particularly around financial distress and actually predicting financial insolvency. And there is a peculiarity with professional football and professional sport more broadly, I guess, that prevents some of those teams going into liquidation, unlike what we would see in kind of mainstream businesses, if you like. I also look very heavily at competitive balance in professional team sports. We've devised a fairly robust methodology now that we can overlay to a range of different sports. And we also look at managerial change and the impact of managerial change, particularly within football, and how that managerial change might have an impact on the longer term success of organisations. And what we'll see here is just while I'm clicking through are some of the key publications that we've put together over the last 10 years or so. All of these are available if anybody wants to see them, and I've certainly sent Niall some shorter form commentaries where we're giving our opinions on situations in the professional game. So that's a little bit about me and my research team. And like I say, a lot of what you see today is both my own research and that Dr. Dan Plumley has put together as well. So in terms of the session today, all I want to really do is explore how professional sport and its teams in the context of today, professional football clubs generate revenue and have driven revenue growth. I think it's fair to say that one of the key outcomes of the presentation is going to be that football, in its broadest sense, does not have a revenue problem. There is no issue with revenue generation per se. The critical issue in professional football, as it is, quite frankly, across a number of professional sports, is not that revenue generation, albeit difficult to achieve sometimes, but is the cost control and the lack of control over those costs, which goes back to my point about the winner takes all scenario and this search and this drive for self-interest and ignoring the teams that are around you. I'm also going to provide an overview of costs against revenues and look at the causes of financial distress in English professional football. I've probably given the game away somewhat by telling you that it's a cost control issue rather than a revenue generating one. And I'm also going to look at the future and the future challenges for the industry, and also talk a little bit about investment potential. I've been doing a huge amount of work recently with private equity and private capital, their investment potentially into sport, and the benefits I think that can bring to the game overall. So a quick bit of context for you just to set the scene, and many of you will know this already, particularly those of you that are working in and around the sports sector. This is industry context pre-COVID. So we know that the football market has grown significantly over the past decades. The combined revenues for the top 20 clubs that operate across European competition has exceeded 8 billion euros now. And that 8 billion euros, of course, is not generated through match day ticket sales. That is ostensibly driven through broadcast and media rights and the increasing prevalence of sponsorship and commercial endorsements. For those of you that are familiar with the Deloitte Annual Review of Football Finance or the Money League, the 20th edition saw Manchester United, Barcelona, Real Madrid become the first clubs to pass 600 million euros in terms of their revenue generation. And of course, whilst COVID has had a slight impact on those revenues, what we will see from all of those clubs, and indeed right across those top 20 European clubs, is only a marginal reduction in their overall revenue. We hear bandied around in the media that the coronavirus pandemic has probably cost European football something in the region of 2 billion euros. If you look at some of the FIFA and UEFA reports, that's certainly the figure that they're starting to tenuously place on the impact. What we need to remember is that 2 billion euro impact is across a huge number of different clubs. So when we average that out, the impact is much smaller. And of course, as you move down league systems, as we'll see shortly, the impact is actually felt much more broadly at clubs that are operating in the English Football League Championship, the English Football League 1 and English Football League 2. The most recent edition, so the 24th edition, has, as I say, estimated that 2 billion loss across that the impact of COVID. But I think we really need to be careful about how we average that out across member clubs there. Broadcasting revenues, commercial and sponsorship growth have completely changed the landscape of European football. I'll show you some of the impact of the television deals in the English Football League shortly. And the Premier League continues to leave its European rivals in its wake, generating almost twice as much as its closest rival La Liga as a revenue generating machine. And that really, to go back to some of the points made about the European Super League, is why clubs in La Liga and in Serie A in particular were so keen for that European Super League to take place, because it would raise their revenue bar, so to speak. And I found it even more perplexing that the English Premier League clubs would want to be part of that competition, because they already, go back to self-interest, they are already top of the tree with regard to European competition. We only need to look at the Champions League and the Europa League finalists to see that. Financial fair play and regulatory practice is taking shape to improve sustainability, but in the same way, it's also protected what we could consider to be the status quo, and it is having quite a significant impact on the competitive balance and integrity right the way across European football. So let's take a quick look at revenue generation as an example. This is typical of what you would probably see by source. So this is what you would hope to see rather by source, is that your match day revenue here highlighted in green, commercial revenue in blue, and your broadcasting in yellow. And we would always call broadcast income unearned because it's centrally contracted through the collective bargaining agreements, certainly in the case of the Premier League. Look at Barcelona, it broadly fits that particular mould. And if we look at Everton, though, what we can see is that 71% of Everton's income is generated through the sale of those broadcast rights. So it makes them highly dependent on that broadcast rights deal, which is why I think the Premier League was so keen to roll over the next 3 years of that deal based on its current situation. You can also see here the very, very small marginal impact that matchday revenue has. So when we get into discussions around ticket pricing, season ticket pricing, I'm a great believer that Premier League clubs really ought to be charging about 20 quid for a match ticket, and there would be a much stronger argument to charge higher fees as you go down the divisions. Because whilst Everton's revenue profile in 2019 is highlighted there, if you pick any club in League Two, what you would probably see is that this 71% actually is then made up of your match day ticket receipts, a much higher proportion of revenue being driven by those match day crowds, around about the same actually in terms of commercial revenue. And then this smaller percentage, the 8 to 10, maybe 15%, will come from solidarity payments or some of the media rights revenue through things like iFollow. So we look at the TV deals in the EPL. You can see here that there is absolutely no issue with revenue generation for the top division. We've moved from a contract value in 1992-93 of 304 million. That gave an annual rights fee of around 61 million. That annual rights fee now stands at just under 1.5 billion pounds. Of course, we have many, many more matches, but interestingly, these fees per live match, you can see, have changed systematically. The 2016-17 deal was significant with Sky and BT both really overpaying as part of that overall broadcast deal before we got to the 2019-20 deal around about 7.4 million. And we're starting to see more digital providers enter that space. What's interesting is that if you go right the way back to the Burns report in 2005 and the pressure that was put on government to redistribute some of this TV revenue, there were agreed percentages. So around about 6, 7, 8% of these TV contracts were designed to be redistributed through the English Football League. And actually, since we've seen a significant amount of change over the last few years, that percentage actually has dropped quite markedly, actually. And whilst the Premier League will say they reinvest heavily across the football pyramid, including grassroots, the reality is that the absolute amounts have trickled up, but the relative proportions have really stayed the same. And I think that's a key consideration for us. I want to touch on parachute payments simply because I can't stand them as a concept. I think aside from rewarding failure, what they also do is completely destroy any semblance of competitive balance or competitive integrity that we have throughout the league system. What you can see here is that a Premier League club being relegated into the Championship for this year. So Fulham, for instance, will earn 42 million. That is 4 times bigger than most average revenues of clubs in the Championship. So it makes the opportunity of a parachute payment or a club in receipt of parachute payments rather, twice as likely statistically to get re-promoted to the Premier League. And if you think about that, the impact that has on all of the other teams in that league, and then the knock-on effect to clubs in League One and League Two, it's A, significant, and B, causes some quite quite emotional decisions to be made in terms of player acquisition, in terms of player wages, and that is where the cost control issue begins. These solidarity payments have trickled up ever so slightly. It's around about 7 to 8 million per club in the Championship, about 1 million in League One, about 500,000-600,000 in League Two. So really, you're going from a deal in the Premier League where a Premier League competing team will earn around about 100 to 120 million pounds for their season in the Premier League, right the way down to League Two, where you're getting about 500,000. So you can see the importance, therefore, of match day income for teams certainly that are participating in League Two. And this brings us nicely through to the cost side of the equation. And what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is an exponential increase really in costs, particularly through player wages and transfer fees. This goes back to that issue of self-interest. So Club X might look for a particular player, Club Y might really want that player, and that drives the value up. So basics of supply and demand drives the value up of the player, but also provides the player with the leverage to acquire a much higher contract value through their wages. And until clubs realise that they have to work collectively with each other to try and limit some of that expenditure, those costs are going to continue to spiral out of control. Another major cost escalation, of course, has been in the area of stadia and arena construction. I don't want to labour that point, but that are important capital costs, particularly as you move down through the league systems, but they sit outside of the overall cost controls that I'm going to talk to you about shortly. And that cost control mechanism is absolutely vital, which is why salary cap proposals, certainly in League One and League Two, I felt were really, really important, and probably more so in the Championship, albeit they haven't taken hold. So if we have a very quick look, and this is just some data that I extracted quickly yesterday, at the losses made by Championship clubs between 2014 and 2019. Of course, we're still waiting for some of the most up-to-date figures to come out. The first thing to notice, of course, is that none of these clubs on average are breaking even. So there's your break-even point at the very, very top. Pre-tax profits have continued to escalate. Remember that because now we're below the curve, all of these figures are higher and higher. 2018-19, on average, 30 million pound loss over the course of the season. And then there's operating profits around about 40 million pounds. And again, the revenue profiles of most Championship clubs will sit in the region of 10 to 15 million. So this is almost a fourfold increase in loss-making potential. When we overlay the wages, we can see why those clubs are making such significant losses. So the red bars here are the wages for those Championship clubs. The blue bar, the revenue. And I don't know about you, but the last time I checked, if you run a business where your costs are higher than your revenues, then you tend to fail and you tend to go into liquidation. And that's no different from us as individuals. We earn our wages over the course of the week. That hopefully pays our mortgages off, or pays for our rent and pays for our living expenses. If we exceed that expenditure with our revenue, then we get into financial difficulty. And it's the same for me as it is for one of my mates who runs a cafe, as it is for all of these clubs. The difference, of course, at a personal level, is we are in total control of the actions. And I would argue that all of these clubs are in control of their actions too, but I think they're also driven by a desire to compete and a desire then to catch up. And I think it's that race to the bottom that is causing the biggest issue with regard to cost control. And we could overlay League One and League Two here. The picture is slightly better on average terms if we're going to generalise, but there is still some outliers where those costs are significantly higher than the income that's brought in. I think the picture really at League One and Two level is much better than it is in the Championship, and we're still seeing these wages rise in that competition. That brings me through to my last 2 or 3 slides here. This is some of our latest research that we've done on Too Big to Fail, accounting for predictions of financial distress. It's about 8,000 words as a paper, so I shan't bore you with too much of the detail, but what I try to do is take our academic research and I take it into the media. So we put a couple of columns together for the Mail Online here, particularly around coronavirus. But the key finding is that all of our results, and this is data that runs now through the last 20 years or so, all of this data shows significant cases of financial distress amongst clubs in both divisions, and that Championship clubs are significantly poorer in financial health terms than those in the English Premier League. Of course, they're getting all that broadcast money. In some cases, financially sustainable clubs are there, they exist, but it's worsened since the advent of financial fair play, and that's still because of the opportunity for owners to invest limited amounts and amortize player contracts over a number of years. Because of those big six, due to their size, they seem to be more financially sound. They can cope with playing in empty stadiums and so on. And the issues are felt much more broadly as we move down the system. So you kind of multiply it, if you like, as you go down through the system. Overall, the financial situation in English football is really quite poor. It's a position that can well or could well be exacerbated by the economic crisis caused by COVID-19. Notwithstanding some of the government support that's come in and some of the loans that are available via the EFL, I think the sanctions around those about player trading are going to be really, really important. So let's try and conclude this then. Sport properties, in my view, need to be increasingly focused on the long-term game. That's about making sure your books get balanced properly and that you take incremental steps to improve your business. You don't literally put it all on the line and hope for promotion, and that therefore is tied to sporting success. So we need to educate fans, I think, and the extension of the game to understand that running financially sustainable clubs should be first and foremost, and that will lead, and our data shows this, that the more stable you are off the field, the more stable you will be on the field. An abundance of competition supports the potential for future financial returns, and this is why I think private capital is quite interesting, regardless of COVID. So we will have new media rights, we will have new digital platforms that get involved. There is an opportunity for new competition structures, whether that's through European competition, whether that's through cup competitions, or whether that's through different revenue sharing arrangements. And of course, we've heard about regulation and governance reform. I think through maturity, we will see the frequency of investment increase, and that will include joint ventures and minority share investments. I think we should embrace that as a positive thing because that spreads risk and limits exposure. So as consumption becomes increasingly digital, sport-related media and technology companies will attract broader investment attention. That will naturally flow into the game from a revenue context. New products and expansion of markets will also see that new investment. And a key consideration will need to be found in how commercial frameworks begin to govern the future of their sports. And we heard a bit about that in terms of an independent regulator and the impact that organising bodies might be able to have. And this is where I come back to my private equity, private capital point. I think the opportunity for that investment brings with it a lot of objective managerial interest. And I think that might just tip the balance in favour of objective decision making rather than emotional decision making. I've covered most of this as I've talked through, but that redistribution of broadcasting rights is really important. I think challenging the government and the Premier League around the collective bargaining agreement and the amount of money that is flowing down the system needs to be looked at much more fervently. I think there's an absolute need for a hard salary cap at league level, and I would say that through the Championship, through League One, League Two, and potentially even through the National League, because cost control is the biggest challenge. We need to revisit financial fair play to make sure it's in the best interests of the clubs and the leagues involved, and we need to move to a much more collective action orientated approach to much more collective action as an approach to competitive balance and running leagues as successful entities rather than having individual clubs that do very, very well. But while there's an ongoing power struggle between the Premier League and the EFL, I think that's going to be quite difficult, and again provides a need for somebody independent to step in and help out. Now, before I finish, just a very, very quick call to action, because I know that Fair Game has a number of clubs involved. My research team has a UKRI funded study focused on counting the cost of COVID-19 on football, and importantly, its communities. And we're still looking for participants to join that study. We're looking for clubs to endorse it and for clubs to help us engage with the economic impact on their community. So if you're interested in that, then please do drop me a line. Niall, I'm going to finish there if that's okay. I hope my messages were clear and coherent, because I did try and rush through that a little bit.
No, that's fine, Rob. That's because I am to blame for giving you less time than originally planned. There have been some great questions. I'm just going to run through these three. We'll only about take those three, and then we'll break so everybody can have a cup of tea before the panel starts. Sure. And Dave does write long things. I love Dave, but he's written a very long comment in the chat.
Some good comments.
They are some good comments. So the first one, best ways of redistributing money through the pyramid, and why is it needed? Okay,
so I think at my absolute core, I'm a great believer in the pyramid system that we have in English football. And naturally, we will always grow very, very big clubs in that context. And there will be clubs that operate in the mid-tier or even at the bottom tier. Culturally, I think that's important. I think it underpins the fabric of our competition. But what we have to remember is that you need two teams to participate on a field of play. And I hate it when I hear teams in the top of the Premier League saying that they want a bigger share of TV rights because people want to tune into Manchester United versus Liverpool rather than Stoke versus West Brom. But what those big six clubs don't realise is that Manchester United playing Stoke is what provides, or Manchester United playing West Brom is what provides the media interest in a season's worth of competition. So we have to understand that it's that pyramid that supports those elite teams in the Premier League, and therefore without them, those Premier League teams would never be able to generate the 5, 6, 7, 8 billion pounds worth of TV revenue that they get on a 3-year cycle. So I'm absolutely clear that you have to redistribute more of that revenue. I would suggest that the government should say, if you want us to allow you to collectively bargain your TV rights, because let's face it, that means it's a cartel and it is essentially illegal. So we'll facilitate you running that collective bargaining, but in doing so, you have to give up 10% of your revenue to the Football League and to the grassroots community, and the FA would distribute that. Could speak about that for quite a while, but I've tried to be concise.
No, it's fine, Rob. And that's one of the issues that we will be wanting to talk about and develop in the weeks ahead to look at how that shapes our proposals. Mark Chapman's come through and said, would you promote, this is one that we've also been debating, a salary cap as an absolute fixed figure or as a percentage of turnover?
Okay, so I'll put my hand up now. I did some consultation for the Football League last year about the economic impact of salary caps, and I signed a non-disclosure agreement on that, so I can't really talk about it publicly. What I will say is that my general view is that it should have been done on a percentage of turnover, but the legal eagles that I work with tell me that that's anti-competitive and limits what players can earn depending on the club that they play for, which leads us then to the hard cap that you have to sit at a league level. So in the Championship, I think that should be around about £16 million for the record. And that's done by working out a kind of average turnover of clubs in the league, because the danger with any salary cap is that a small club, let's say they earn 6 or 8 million over the course of a season, will try to keep pace with the team that earns 30 million a season and is having to limit its expenditure. So I think we need to be really careful what we do, but the hard league level cap seems to be the most appropriate and the legally most sustainable.
Okay, I will admit that we'll be exploring that, Rob, in the weeks ahead and trying to look at how to do that, because that's one that we've been definitely talked about. John Scales has come out with a question: what's the win for the big Premier League teams to distribute greater proportions of money? If the Premier League is so successful, what's their concerns with a regulator and more fairness? Okay, so first part of the question first. The Premier League is built on the competition that it's able to generate. So it's in the Premier League's interest to make sure that clubs that are moving up through the divisions are equally competitive. So by providing them a slightly bigger share of the TV rights deal through solidarity payments, teams that are promoted to the Premier League would naturally be more competitive. Teams relegated out of the Premier League would therefore be competitive in the division that they've dropped into.
So it increases and it improves the standard of competition in every single division, and therefore makes the Premier League even more marketable, in my view, from an economics perspective. Noel, what was the second part of the question?
And what are the concerns of the Premier League with the regulator and more fairness?
It's a good question, isn't it? I think it goes back to self-interest and the fact that most Premier League teams are only bothered about themselves. They forget that they need to participate against other clubs. They are only ever looking upwards to see how they might be able to climb the leagues so that they can either qualify for Europe and earn the money that's on offer there, or win the trophies that are on offer there. So they like the status quo, is what I'm trying to say. And the irony, there is an irony for me that Manchester City were one of the clubs that agreed to UEFA's financial fair play back in 2011, and by doing so, prevented another Manchester City scenario ever happening again, because you're locking out owner investment through that through those financial fair play rules. So I think it's all about protecting the status quo and protecting their own positions in the division.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. We will end it there just to give people 7 minutes. Huge thank you, Rob. Obviously, we will come back to you. You're there as one of our advisors now, which is brilliant news. And we will be looking to take your expert brain, tap into it along with a few others, and look at developing the real solutions that we can do to solve the problems in our game. So without that, we'll take a 7-minute break, come back at 11:30. So everybody go and get a nice cup of tea or whatever, a coffee, and we'll see you back here in 7 minutes time for our panel. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for our presentations from Rob, from Greg, from Rad this morning, and we'll see you back here in 7 minutes. And I'll give you also an update on some interesting news in the world of fair game as well. Cheers, bye. hopefully everybody's managed to get a nice cup of tea and it is in a happy place. And we're ready for our second part of today. You can just see that Rob's just dropped in the chat that if you'd like to discuss anything further with him, his email address is there. Obviously, Rob is one of our key advisors going forward, so he will be part of some of our discussions as we look to develop proper papers and so forth in the weeks and months ahead. So that's great news. Thank you very much, Rob. So without further ado, I will hand over to Darren Bernstein, who is a lecturer of fantastic background experience in football that goes on for a long, long time, and is now connected with Bury AFC, one of the fair game clubs. So it's wonderful to have him here with us. Brad, can I just ask you to turn off your video? Thank you, Brad. And then before we go much further, there's one big announcement I wanted to make, and I'll just check to see whether it can actually come through from the person, whether they've actually managed to log in yet. They may not have done. Just checking through that panel. Not yet, but I will tell you that in the last 5-10 minutes, we've just got an email through from Bristol Rovers, who have become the latest addition to Fair Games. So it's wonderful news to have Bristol Rovers on board. So that's brilliant. So I'm really happy and chuffed about that as well. And they will be connecting in with that and joining in with our various management team meetings and so forth. That's wonderful news. So I'll stop there and hand over to Darren. Darren, over to you.
Thanks, Niall. As Niall said, so I'm now a lecturer at UCFB, the Etihad, and currently a director of Bury AFC, having worked at the FA and the Football League previously. I'm delighted to be able to chair the expert panel we've got, and hopefully it'll draw together everything that's been discussed this morning, but also the last 3 events. I'm sure you enjoyed the morning session. There's lots in there to take from Adoika and Greg, and also Rob Wilson. So there's much to discuss from these presentations, and I'm sure we'll get the reflections of the speakers in this session. So, but importantly, it's about moving things forward, making sure we find effective, realistic, pragmatic solutions so we can improve the governance and sustainability of the game. And importantly for me, not just at the Premier League level or the Football League, but right down through the pyramid to grassroots. The worry for me is we focus on the top, there will be a race to the bottom because things can go under the radar. But I'm going to introduce you very briefly to the panel. We've got Dave Boyle, who's the former Chief Exec of Sports Direct and Vice Chair of the Football Sports Federation. We've got David Goldblatt, who's an Honorary Fellow at the International Centre for History and Culture of Sport at De Montfort. Christina Philippou, who's Director of Financial Management of University of Portsmouth. And we've got Nigel Clibbens from the Chief Exec of Carlisle United. We're also going to be discussing some questions which you might have read, and which will be the basis for the session around what can we realistically achieve within the FA and the Football League, and how can we make it last. What financial rules need to change. We need to remember that we're not starting from a blank piece of paper. There's plenty of regulation that we already have, and do we need to make it work better for what we've got? Is an independent regulator the silver bullet? What will it look like? How do we create and maintain a healthy football ecosystem? And what's going to stop these changes happening? So there's lots to fit in. I'm going to ask the panelists to speak for about 10 or 15 minutes. So we've got lots of time for discussion and questions. So I'm going to start off by asking Dave Boyle to start us off. Dave has been a long advocate of good governance in football. So Dave, how do we get here? Where are we? Where are we going?
Okay, so I suppose my first comment is that I go back to the Chester report of 1967 to 68, which basically makes almost exactly the same points which have been made in this session. And we go forward and we've got the Football Task Force in 99, which makes exactly the same points. The Burns Review, The only institution which I can tell in British society which has been reviewed more to such little effect is the press. And the reasons why nothing has happened are pretty much similar, in that essentially the institutions who are consistently adjudged to be failing in their role are able to marshal political forces to scare off a government which wishes to take action. That government also has been noticeably absent in terms of any carrots it can offer. The initial carrot it was offered by the Wilson government in '68 was funding to do up the Olympic gallery at Wembley Stadium. Having signed off on the money, the Labour government was not elected in '70, and they didn't follow through on the recommendations. But normally the political dynamic has been that a government is ambivalent about wanting to do something about this. The football bodies are adamant that it will not happen. And into that mix, you need a government which is actually prepared to have a fight and prepared to run the risk of not winning. And that's just not been around. You also have the situation where governments really want to host World Cups, and it's almost like you can tell there is talk of regulatory intervention in football in the air because England start talking about bidding for the World Cup. It happened in 1999, it's now happening again. And it seems to me that once you hook a government into the prize of wouldn't it be marvellous if England hosted a World Cup, you then have the situation whereby the government are kind of on the hook. They need the FA more than the government than the FA needs the government. And whilst the government, obviously, that's completely wrong-headed, because you can't stage major tournaments without the state throwing a lot of its weight in behind it. Governments start to become very mindful of the FA, and the FA just simply have to say one word, which is FIFA. And the moment they drop that word into the conversation, the government start to get nervous. And the government then starts to worry about losing this World Cup. The fact that the wider, David Goldblatt can talk about this till the cows come home, as can others. The fact that we don't have a cat in shell's chance of getting the World Cup is neither here nor there. It's a very useful thing the government use. So we've got no desire to use a stick from government. We've got no real carrots to offer from government, and we've got adamant and implacable opposition. So into that mix, the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, are the political forces at present aligned in such a way as to make this a different calculation than happened in 1968 or 99 or 2005 or 2010? And I'm not close enough to the discussions with people like Tracy Crouch and indeed the wider government. One of the things affecting is nobody knows what this government really thinks. It's part of the kind of, the British state has lost its ability to be read externally because it's become much more criminological or autocratic in that sense. So who knows whether the government would actually get around to doing something this time. I think you can weigh up the pros and cons, but it feels awfully like basically a pub chat rather than a kind of serious strategic discussion about what might be the best way forward. So I come back to thinking a regulatory apparatus if there is a political moment, it's a window which will be open for a short amount of time. As it's only open for a short amount of time, we need to get in with a surgical strike and get out. It's a running down the trench of the Death Star rather than a massive campaign, battle on the moon of Endor, to continue the analogy way past breaking point. And as a result, the things Rob talked about, which were, they're things I've been hearing for 25 years. I've been hearing, I went to Sean Hamill's first conference at PERT back in 1999, and all of these things were being talked about. We know all of this. And my fear is that if we try and come up with the perfect solution, which will solve all of these problems, it will get bogged down in policy details. So we need a surgical strike and ask of government, do this and then bugger off and leave us to it. So there needs to be an iterative framework. And this thing which was mentioned in the first presentation about a kind of, the critical thing for me is what's the framework for amending the framework? Because it's going to need to be an iterative process. And as things go on, we tighten regulations, we bring in new regulations. To use an analogy, it's a bit like Buckaroo. where you kind of load more things onto it and more regulatory demands or impositions onto this framework, which clubs have to comply with. But the actual thing we need to happen is that this thing gets created. We argue about what it does afterwards, once it's in place and once it's set in stone. And the critical thing is to keep government engaged until it is set in stone. In 1999, they created a football regulatory authority, which soon became the Independent Football Commission, which soon became two people hearing complaints about whether your pie was too hot and you burnt your mouth on it. And so that kind of, lots of people said we've got something, and it turned out we didn't have anything. So there needs to be consistent engagement. There needs to be this ratchet effect, and I think it needs to be taken on board that football clubs will find ways through. I liken football clubs' approach to regulation in the way water is to a house. It will always find its bloody way in. And in this case, football clubs will always find their bloody way out, because they have a lot of incentive to find the chink in the regulatory armour, which will enable them to advance on the field. It will constrain their ability less. Football clubs don't like to be constrained in any way, shape or form. They like to have maximum operating visibility. They like to be able to think of anything they might do, they can do. So they will always be looking to get out of it, but that will be no reason why we should stop doing it. It will be no reason why, this argument used to hear in the early 2000s, that people will go, what's the point of regulating anything? Because clubs will just break the rules. Which is a bit like saying, well, what's the point of having a law saying you shouldn't kill anybody, because people still get killed? So why bother, folks? It's insane, and it's asinine. And it's also, thankfully, it feels to me, I made a comment about, it feels like the kind of high point of peak neoliberalism in football has been passed. We are past the stage of people offering silly defences as to why regulation isn't necessary, along the lines of regulation will always be avoided, therefore it is pointless. One of the things I want to think about, though, is could what we're talking about be done within football? My concern is that creating an external architecture to football invites the FIFA defence that this is an intervention in the ability of the governing body to have full purview over all of its activities. And that's the kind of easy argument to make, which will be made. When actually, could another way to do this to actually be legislating for sports law provision? The UK's, this is a hobby horse I've been banging for 10 years, and so I'm going to ride my hobby horse now because I can. Apologies if that's what's the word, an abuse of this process. But essentially, my concern is that English sport exists in a netherworld of non-law. It's governed by stadium construction law, planning law. It's governed by commercial law in the sense of their corporate structures. Companies are governed by company law. There isn't really anything called sports law, which is quite unusual in European legal contexts. Most countries have a sports law facility where there is the state gives the permission to a regulatory authority, i.e. the Football Association, to run the sport on in that country and that territory. And that gives them an ability to sort of come in and say, lift up the lid and say, you're not doing this very well, frankly, but otherwise to let them get on with it. Because it seems to me that if we're going to get a regulatory authority, either we put all our eggs in the basket of getting the government to go, this time we are going to not listen to the FA and not listen to the Premier League and not listen to any of the established powers that be, who will always find problems with what we're proposing. That actually, might it make more sense to try and work with these progressive forces within these sports governing bodies to say, what are the things stopping you guys from doing this effectively? If they don't want to do it, that's a suitable case for coming in with your big blunderbuss from government. If, however, there are progressive forces which need supporting to overcome some of the forces arranged against them, would it be another strategy to work with those forces and bring government in to help win the battle within sport? My argument would be sports law, which would empower the football authorities to make decisions in the interests of sport as opposed to the interests of economics or burnishing state power in the Middle East, or some of the other motivations which seem to drive the decision making at the bigger clubs. You then have the FA as the body which regulates all clubs, which it does at the moment. It just doesn't do it very well. But my concern is that the idea of replacing it with something external is something which has been talked about for 25 years, and I'm yet to see an actual practical proposal as to how it happens. Now, I know there was discussion of that earlier in this morning, but I still think there are some fundamental problems as to how we get into a world where that actually has come to pass, which isn't going back to the task force in 1999, where football says we have created an independent regulator and everyone goes, hurrah, God bless, and nothing actually happens. So something to actually underpin it in legislative terms will be necessary, but I do wonder if this is too big a legislative cherry to bite, and actually a more surgical strike might be appropriate. Anyway, I've gone too long. Thanks very much, Darren.
Thank you, Dave. And there's a lot to unpick there, but certainly the window of opportunity is one that we need to take, and definitely that the balance of the utopian view with what can be practically implemented before that window closes. I'm going to move swiftly on to David Goldblatt, and I'm going to ask you to take the floor and give us your insight into what does healthy, sustainable ecosystems look like. What do we need to do to get there? So David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dave Boyle, first of all. That was just like fantastic, and much of what I was going to say, including the joke about burning your mouth on a pie and the regulator dealing with it, were in my notes. So I'm going to just scrap all of that and say, for me, just distill, first of all, what was the most important things that Dave said, because I think they really set out what we've got to be thinking about. And that is that, as the Chester report and the experience of the Football Task Force, the Burns report, we have to have legislation. There's no negotiating with the Premier League. There's no negotiating with the big clubs. It's like we have to have this fixed in law. And this is a window of opportunity. And I think, as Dave said, the issue of whether the Football Association can do it aside, for the moment, I'll come back to. We need to be thinking about what will the Conservative Party, as well as the government, actually buy. I think the government point is, who knows, who has Johnson spoken to this morning? But I do think we need to think hard about, what will the Damien Collins of this world, what will they vote for? What are they prepared to back? What will Dowden actually be prepared to expend some political capital? Because, as Dave said, you will have to expend some political capital to put something meaningful through the Houses of Parliament, and for it not to come out as the hapless result we had last time. So I think a really hard bit of thinking, we need to be talking to backbench Conservatives. What are they thinking? What will they stand? What's in it for them? I think that's really, and I don't know the answer. That's not a milieu that I am moving in. I fear sometimes that, the leftish end of football and the communitarian minded is not always, engaged with those circles. And we really, really need to be knowing where they're at. And I put that out to everybody. I mean, I'm really interested to know what everybody else thinks about that. A second thought on, and it's a minor but perhaps useful thing to think about, is while we're putting this all out there, maybe one of the things that a regulator of any kind, and certainly someone who is annually signing off the sustainability of football clubs, needs to be doing is thinking about the environmental policies of football clubs. We are entering an era in which the climate crisis will be affecting football. It's affecting grassroots pitches now that are being flooded for a third of the year because of extreme weather. We have the Football Association itself and a number of Premier League clubs signed up to the UN Sport for Climate Action framework on this. And in Germany, the Unser Fußball policy proposals put together by the network of German football clubs last autumn, of football supporters organisations, I should say, advocated that the annual Bundesliga financial check should be supplemented by a environmental check. And if you're not committed to or making progress towards carbon zero, then you can't play. And that's without focusing too much on the detail of it. I would say that's the kind of thing that this Tory party probably could get behind. Yeah, football clubs, yeah, everybody's got to be green, COP26. You know, that's the kind of thing that they could, you know, that would be, yes, that's a good thing that a regulator could be doing. So I think that's something that we should put into the mix. And the third thing to think about is, again, further down the line, you know, having established what the government and or its supporters might stand for, you know, how do we put pressure on them? I think it's really important to think about what's going into those MPs' mailbags that actually get them to focus and concentrate, if only for a very short period of time. And I'd be interested to know, again, what people think the language and the mode of that will be. So just to summarize, yeah, I think Dave is right to say we need something super duper focused. We can't have the whole package. We've got to have something, I think, you know, in a way, almost the more minimalist, the better, but we've got to open the door this time. That needs to be thought about. I think that's almost the most important thing. All the details, the really detailed stuff, I think can come later. So yeah, that's just those are my thoughts. That's a really important conversation. I don't know the answers. I'm really interested to know what everybody else thinks.
Thank you, David. And I think in terms of that level of focus, what it does do is it brings us on nicely to Christina, who's a published expert in this area around independent regulation, and how can that independent regulator make things better, Christina, and how can we ensure that focus because of this window of opportunity? So over to you, Christina.
Thanks, and thanks everyone. It's really nice that actually pieces of what I was going to talk about, people have already kind of talked about in detail, so I don't have to kind of do that and recap stuff. I think ultimately, I've worked with a lot of regulators. My research is around sport regulation in general, but in my previous life, when I worked at Deloitte, I did a lot of work with regulators of various kind of functions. And the big thing is, it's all well and good to say, you know, we've got a window of opportunity, which I completely agree with, and we need to do something now, ride the wave, or we're going to be stuck on the shelf again, which I completely agree with. But also having seen what tends to happen if regulators get a very kind of broad sort of remit, that's when things just kind of don't happen. And I think this is where kind of fair game can help and kind of put forward some very specific sort of policies. What, again, like David said, you know, do you want to look at environmental stuff as part of your remit? Do you want to be looking at cost controls as part of your remit? Do we want to be looking at diversity as part of the remit? You have to be quite specific and not sort of go, yeah, we need an independent regulator. There are lots of issues in football. There are lots of policies in football. Okay, if you look at the grassroots, you look at the FA, you look at the Premier League, you look at the EFL, you look at UEFA, you look at FIFA. They all have their code of conduct. They all have their constitutions. They all have, you know, a handbook or a code of ethics, and there are loads of policies in there that relate to all these issues that we've been talking about today, right? It's more a matter of a lot of this kind of stuff gets swept under the carpet or doesn't get focused on, which is why we have got to the situation where we've got to today in terms of all the financial issues that Rob was talking about earlier. So I think in terms of what kind of fair game should do and what we should be talking about really is kind of putting forward some very specific, this is what you need to look at to make sure that yes, the regulator idea does go through, but also make sure that the issues are addressed and it's not kind of a general thing, right? We've got, I mean, you know, there's FFP, there are all sorts of policies. Yes, we can argue about, you know, directors and owners tests and how useful they are and how useful FFP is, but the policies are there. Part of the issue is the monitoring side of things. You know, then arguably they're not being monitored properly. I think that's where the kind of benefit of having an independent regulator, somebody from outside the game coming in and going, yeah, this is your policy, you haven't implemented it, right? You're not even, and then you can almost circumvent some of the issues of, okay, we're going to then come clash with FIFA, with UEFA, with the FA, with the Premier League. It's like, these are your policies and you're not implementing them. So I think that is really where we could actually get round some of the issues that would kind of clash where the independent regulator idea is. I think. I mean, I was going to talk about, you know, how you set a regulator up and the kind of things we think about, but I think people have already done that, so I don't want to kind of rehash old ground. But I think really we should be thinking about what do we want to focus on and why, and get that message across very succinctly.
Thanks, Christina. And it's, for me, it's quite refreshing to hear that, having worked at the league, at the FA, but also as a director of Bury. And on the sessions that I've been on, it keeps coming back to what would stop another Bury. And when you think about that in relation to the window of opportunity and the need for focus, what are those things that we've already, like you say, we've already got regulation, but are we implementing it? And, you know, what role does a regulator have to play in that? I completely agree with you. Is it a mixture of cost control and ownership issues? How do we stop these people coming in that were haphazard with the way that they implemented the rules? And how did we let them in anyway?
And how do we continue to monitor as well, right? Because it's all well and good. People have come in, great. Okay, we now see that there are some issues. What do we do next?
Yeah. Sure. And what's great is that leads us very neatly on to Nigel. From a club perspective, how do we create this realistic, lasting change? And from your perspective, as a club, with fellow colleagues as clubs, how do we implement these changes and make them last and effective?
Wow. Well, I've been listening intently to all these different perspectives from outside the game. Obviously, I'm inside the game. I live it every day. So the different perspectives are really interesting. So I'll just kind of give you a run through of a few things that immediately appear to me. I think Dave talked about progressive forces for change and empowering them to try and make a difference. There are progressive forces within the game, but the structure and the environment means that those will never get past green shoots. They will quickly disappear. There's a number of reasons, in no particular order. I think the first really important thing for everybody to try and understand is that there is a fundamental difference between the different people involved inside football. So the owners are different to the clubs. The clubs in a division are different to the clubs in a higher division, and groupings within each division are different to other groupings in the division. So that creates a whole host of conflicts and total asymmetries in interest. So what is good for one group is totally wrong for another part of the game, and whether that's owners, fans, or or other clubs. So, for instance, it's not just about the top of the Premier League, so the big six again versus the other 14. You have issues in the Championship, between the Championship and the Premier League. You have issues within the Championship, the big clubs versus the Rotherhams at the bottom. You have then issues in between the Championship and League One and the big clubs in that division. So your Portsmouth, Sunderland, Ipswich against the little clubs like Accrington. And it carries all through the pyramid. So it's really important to understand and not try and just baggage everything in as self-interest, because the self-interests of each individual group are completely different. So what you'll find is that from an owner's point of view, they might, if they've got a lot of cash, they might be quite happy to tip loads of cash into their club to try and get success. They're quite happy to have no transparency. They want total control. But from a club point of view, that's completely different. So looking at assessing what each individual actor in this sector, what their motivations are and how they behave is really, really important. Because if you can then tap into what turns them on and turns them off and keeps good people in the game and the bad people out of the game, going back to Darren's point about Bury, then you can start to solve some of these problems just by the culture that you create within the game. So that's part of it. It goes back to, again, the points that we made about regulation. Football clubs are used to regulation. The rule books that I have are this big, and we've got there's an AGM of the EFL this afternoon, and it will get even bigger with the other 25 regulation changes that are coming. So, and clubs are used to that. They hire clever people the further you go up the food chain to get around the rules. They've got more money than the people who are supposedly regulating them, so they're quite prepared to take them on in a legal battle. They've got more resources because these guys, because the institutions don't have enough people, never mind money, so they can get into an engaged battle with them. So regulation in the detail doesn't frighten them. What the issue that causes concern about, it goes back to a question I think was raised, what have the Premier League got to fear? It's control. It's control over your own destiny, because that lack of control is seen to introduce risk. When you've got risk, it can affect your P&L, and that affects your value at that level. But that is completely different to the likes of Carlisle United, which are effectively a not-for-profit public sector, public organisation with operating in our community. It's not about creating value to sell on, to get minority interests from private equity and all these kinds of things. It's about winning some football matches, providing community service that everybody's proud of, making an impact, and maybe getting up the divisional pyramid. And that is what it means at our level. So if you're regulating for a Carlisle United with 20 employees and 30 footballers and an academy, it's completely different to regulating for Manchester City, which is a global operation. Incomparable. So what concerns me is that we end up with a one-size-fits-all that ends up cascading all kinds of regulation down the pyramid that is unmanageable, which I think then goes back to the point of what are we trying to achieve here? What is the overriding concerns that we think we need to deal with? In my language, what are the problems? What needs fixing, and what are the fixes to address those? Because if we end up looking at everything that's wrong with football, as Dave started off with, nothing's ever going to get done, because it's just going to get totally bogged down in the detail. So I think it needs some focus to think what is actually wrong. What do we want to protect against? So for me, it's things like, are there, and it joins some of these dots together. So it's things like, what do we want to protect about clubs? Because they're different to the game. So as an individual club, what do we not want to happen with it, get another Bury? So what does that look like? What do we want about individuals? And that links into the owners and directors. Again, it's separate to clubs. And then you might go into leagues. What do we want a governance structure for each league to look like? And then finally, what do we want the game to look like? What are the protected characteristics of English football that we want to be guardians over, and we want this regulator to be guardians over? Is that things like use of a stadium? Is it a badge? Is it team colours? What is it? The pyramid, the promotion, the relegation, that ability to come from whatever tier to whatever to the pinnacle of the game. Those are the things that I think a regulator can focus on, and then you can get into some of the stuff that Greg talked about in terms of regulatory standards. Let's pick off some key regulatory standards that we want clubs, individuals, leagues, and the game to fulfill, and then the regulator can look at those and deal with them. And I think those are the sorts of things that immediately spring to mind. But like all things in football, it is such a complex industry, and there's so many things that come together to stop change and create issues. Loads of them that probably never even hit the radar. So we've got issues in youth football about compensation for development of players. We've got issues within the EFL about distribution of money. One of the slides that Rob showed was the massive gap that Parachutes and Solidarity had between the Championship and the Premier League. The next tier on was the gap between the distributions from League One to the Championship within the EFL. It's multiples. There's an 80-12-8 split. So again, we've got to be careful that by just lumping a lot of cash at this problem, it's like squeezing a balloon. You squeeze the problem out of the Premier League, and it just pushes the balloon into the Championship. And then you have a massive disparity between the Championship and League One. So you get the rich owners in League One saying, we can't compete with the bottom end of the Championship now, so what do we do? So you've got to look at very individual parts, but have a real overview. Otherwise, you'll just end up moving the problem from one part of the pyramid to another. The final thing I'd like to say is, where does the regulation end? Darren was talking about right down to grassroots. I think there needs to be a consideration of this regulator. Does it end at the EFL? Does it go down into the National League? Is it National League North and South? Where does their influence end? Because it's very different at League Two to the Premier League, never mind in the National League. So we've got to be really careful about doing one thing in one area to solve a problem, and it creates another one somewhere else. There you
go. Thanks, Nigel. Really useful. And as you were talking, we talk about a football ecosystem, but your description, it's more like a kaleidoscope. And the debate here seems to be who's holding it, who's looking into it, and what does the picture look like? Because when you move that kaleidoscope and all the parts do work together, that it's not independent, and that there is a cause and effect here. I'm going to move on to the chat. There's been lots of chat that's still going on. So there's Dave kindly has answered some questions. So excuse me while I head back through the chat to try and find questions that haven't been answered. Right, we've got so Rodrigo asked, is there a lack of confidence political will that makes you skeptical about independent regulation? I think Dave, you answered that one, didn't you, further down? Sports law sounds like a great idea. How would it be brought about, and how long would it take? So let's take that one. Who wants to? Dave, I think you brought up the sports law. So can you briefly give us a quick answer to that one, and then I'll go across the panel.
Yeah, the main thing is that essentially regulators need to regulate in confidence. And by regulator in this particular part of this conversation, I mean the FA. I remember, I'm a fan of AFC Wimbledon. One of the things which led to the FA and the Football League before it not stopping Milton Keynes happening was that the owners of the club said, you are interfering with our ability to maximise profits. We've found a new market for our product in Buckinghamshire, and you have no right as a sporting regulator to interfere with our profit maximisation strategy. And even though, you know, there's a simple answer to that, as Barry Hearn said as a Football League director, it's bollocks. The Football League at that particular juncture was going through ITV Digital, and it had no money to defend its cause in a court of law when it was threatened. So it folded. They didn't call their bluff, and they folded, and Wimbledon went, and Milton Keynes happened. A sports law basically says you can't sue us for decisions made on sporting grounds, regardless of their negative economic consequences. That's all it basically says. Because of Brexit, we have an opportunity to actually carve this out, because one of the things always getting in the way was essentially one of the 4 fundamental freedoms of the European Union was the free movement of capital. And capital, anything which affected the profit maximisation, became knotty. It was never a massive problem, but it was always a knotty enough problem to prevent anybody moving that direction. So if there is a Brexit dividend in that particular area, that could be one area where there is one. But it's a very simple piece of legislation. It simply says sports is a wonderful thing. It has cultural, social, health benefits, and it needs to be it needs to be run by people who pay heed to all of those benefits and the delivery of the maximisation of all of those benefits across the piece, not just economic. And then says, we have the power to regulate these areas, but we cede that power to these bodies, provided they meet these standards. And these standards are, then you go back to the regulatory discussion, which Greg was raising in the session earlier on, about how what are the tests of good regulation? Well, those become the tests of good national governing bodies. And then from that point onwards, you've then got the ability for internal football decision making, because all the things Nigel's saying about it's messy. Every decision in football is messy. It's because actually they're democratically conceived. The leagues are run by individual league clubs in that league. And that makes for slow decision making, but it is part of the warp and weft. It's just we want to extend that ability to make those decisions higher up to a higher level of decisions than football traditionally eschews as a third rail. And one final point, Darren, you mentioned about how, how do you stop another Bury? Back in the day when the FA was a confident regulator, when people didn't sue regulators for restraint of trade cases in the 1930s, the FA used to have a rule that in order to actually to be a member club of the FA, you had to put in place some articles in the company, which was a member of the FA, which said the FA has a special golden share. And that golden share gives the FA the ability to sack the directors. So in the particular instance of Bury, the problem was Steve Dale controlled the club and was not minded to pay any attention to the Football League or the FA, and nobody could get it out of his hands. If you had that old power the FA used to have, the FA could call a general meeting of Bury FC Limited and sack Steve Dale and put in place a new board of directors who weren't Steve Dale to make different decisions. And the FA stopped using that for no good reason. Like they abandoned gate sharing in the 1980s. It was abroad in the land. It seemed like a good idea at the time that we should let 1,000 flowers bloom because of Thatcherism. But actually, it was a pretty good thing. It was also one of the reasons why Rule 34, which David Conn writes about so eloquently and so consistently, one of the reasons that was upheld for so long was precisely because the FA had the ability to reach into a club and compel change of behaviour because of the powers that gave them. And they just stopped using it because of a fundamental lack of confidence in the 1980s. But I can see no legal reason why it couldn't be resuscitated.
But when we talk about governance and we talk about the FA, we've got to remember that the FA is represented by the clubs. So, and that's the whole essence of this debate, that when you have that, we have a democracy, but it's not working for us because we have clubs being able to change the rules in order to suit their own agenda, which is where we've got to. I'm going to bring in Christina just to answer that question very quickly from before around the sports law. Have you come across anything else around your research that adds to that?
It's more the issues of trying to implement something rather than any positive news, I'm afraid. It's also the governing bodies tend to not like legislation coming in. So we've seen issues, for example, in India with the IOC flexing their muscles when they tried to bring in something similar. So yeah, there are potential issues coming in. So I'm afraid I don't have anything positive to add to that. I've just seen a lot of the negative side when governments have tried to do something like that.
Okay, thank you. And then just very quickly, David, anything to add into this? Well, you're on mute, David.
Thank you. I thought the points Dave made about the Football Association abandoning all of these regulations that they had is really important, A, to remember, and B, it is indicative of what kind of organisation the Football Association has become, and why I think, much as one would like to do it within football, I just don't think they're capable. I mean, everybody's head is full of running the England team and St George's at the best of time. We've gone down the route of trying to democratise the Football Association after the Burns report. You know, there was going to be reform of the FA Council, barely anything. We've had some reform of the FA board, but we haven't got round the delegate problem, which was, I wasn't convinced by the arguments I heard about how to deal with that. You know, 5 members come from the professional game on the Football Association board, 5 from the amateur game, now 3 independents, and they do act like delegates. You know, it's just like, that's what they do. Of course they do. Like Sir Dave Richards on the Football Association's executive board. Oh, there's a man who loves the general good, common purpose. I mean, please don't make me laugh. This is like, it's not going to happen. And I don't think, you know, if you know, we've had some pretty serious, some people in charge, you know, of the chair. Treisman was, you know, engaged with trying to make the Burns report happen. Couldn't make it happen. So I think that's why I think we have to focus on the independent regulator. I think the FA is just not fit for purpose, and I don't think it's ever going to be.
Nigel.
Yeah, I was just going to add that, following on from David's point, I think the delegate issue is a really interesting one. It happens throughout the pyramid. It's not just an issue at the EFL. It's an issue with the EFL board that the EFL's been grappling with since the Berry review. So this isn't just about the FA. I think the interesting thing with where we've got to this point, because I think it's really important, all these structures have evolved very, very slowly over a very long time when the game hasn't really changed much. And they've just crept along with fireside chats, people talking to people who they've known for years, very little change, very little demand for change, very little scrutiny. And in the last 20 years, the football governance world's exploded. And all these institutions that have been governing the game and governing the competitions, their roles have expanded really quickly, and they simply haven't been able to keep up, in my view. And that is the fundamental problem. So they're trying to operate in a world where the structures themselves that they're based on don't fit. So we in the EFL, our rules are changed, and the championship essentially can have a veto almost on the rules because of the voting structures. So again, the decisions are made annually. The game moves very, very, very quickly, and all these structures are not attuned to football in 2021 and the next 25 years. And I think that is a problem. So if you're trying to impose a way of working that reflects the needs of the game today on a structure that's fundamentally based on a game from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you've got no chance. Got no chance. The issues about breakaways and profit motives and external investors looking for a return on investment and all these kinds of things are all totally incongruous with the structures that have been built up over this time, and they simply can't deal with them. So you end up with the rule book chasing the issues. So we have an issue, so we'll create a rule, and then somebody works out how to break the rule, and we get a different rule. So the game is constantly catching up, and it never actually gets ahead. So this is why I think setting what good looks like for the game, the clubs, the divisions, from a wider perspective than the people who are already in it, and who would obviously just going to say what they think works for them, has to be the starting point. For me.
Okay, thanks, Nigel. And I'm going to go to a question that Mark Chapman has asked based on what you were talking about, David, and around, well, what does this agenda look like? You know, have you got one? How would this look in your eyes in terms of that independent regulator? Is it focused? Is it more broad?
I think it's got to be very focused to begin with, and it's got to be. I really think the question's got to be what can be got through. You know, it's the Trojan horse. I mean, yeah. I'd really like to have a regulator that was, you know, very hot on diversity. And, you know, was, as the people making the presentation earlier said, you know, like leading the way and raising the bar and really getting on everybody's case. However, I don't think that's like right now, is that going to fly in the Conservative Party as the purpose of a football? I just think, so we've got to park that stuff. You know, I want 50+1, but like they're really not having that. So I think we've just got to get the regulator, and I think financial sustainability, stopping bankruptcies. I think if we can, a more serious fit and proper persons test with, and again, you know, the FA and the leagues, like these people's capacity to do due diligence is just absolutely pathetic. It is pathetic. I mean, I could do better on the back of an envelope half the time than this lot. It is just laughable. So let's have that. That's what a regulator can do. And then if we can slip environment in under the door, as it were, and, you know, maybe win some support from greenish Tories who want to be seen to do the right thing, that would do me for a start. I would leave issues of money through the pyramid and ownership. I think, though, actually they're the thing I care about most. I actually think I would park it. So that I would go that very, very narrow model.
Great, thanks, David. I'm going to move to Christina. You look like you had some stuff.
Oh no, I was just nodding along. I think financial sustainability is definitely the one that, well, it's the easiest sell as well. Ultimately, right? We don't want another Bury. We don't want. You know, we don't want another Maxfield. We don't want another, even Wigan, right? And we are going to see more of that if we continue down the current path. So it's definitely the one that can get the most support. And ultimately, back to what Dave was saying originally, it's about kind of riding this wave. And I think that is the one that people, you can keep bringing to the surface, and journalists will keep bringing it to the public eye, and then we will, you know, have some momentum retained behind this to be able to push this through. I think the other stuff is stuff that can come later, almost.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move on to wrap up to a question that Sean Hamill has asked, which I quite like, because this hopefully will focus our minds on what if nothing happens, because yeah, we don't move it forward. And I'm gonna start off with Nigel. From a club perspective, if nothing happens, are you still exposed, and your peers around the network, are they still exposed?
I think if nothing happens, by definition, we'll get more of the same. So that'll be incremental change. I think we'll get some responses to the fact that the game needs to rebuild some trust and confidence, so that the institutions will do things which look like that they are facing up to those responsibilities. Whether they actually pass muster and actually make a difference remains to be seen. I think the game's got a real history, and this goes back to decision making, and maybe fans outside the real nitty gritty of what goes on in these decisions might not see this. The game has a history of doing things that look like it's achieving something, but they start off from a premise that let's come up with a rule that doesn't affect anybody. So we will come up with a rule that looks like it's doing something, but doesn't actually affect anybody. And that is the kind of starting point of the regulation that we get. And it moves from, because that can then get through, it goes to David's point, what can we get through in this voting structure with these majorities? We can get through this because it only affects a small number of people. It won't make much difference, but we can get it through. And that is the kind of incremental change that we will continue to get. The structures within the game which make the fundamental issues that we need to fix on sustainability almost impossible for the clubs, even if they wanted to fix. I think everybody needs to understand that. The clubs in the EFL are so vulnerable because they are so unsustainable without the money that they are getting now, never mind any new money, that makes them really weak in any negotiations with the Premier League about any change. It makes them very weak with the football, with the PFA, about any change on wages and wage restraint, because there's a fear that it could get even worse. You can't get into a war with the Premier League to try and get a little bit more because they might take something away. And that has been going on for years and years in the time that I've been involved in this. So when you have a solidarity agreement that's linked to a TV deal that's renewed every 4 years, every 4 years there is a negotiation with the Premier League about solidarity money. And in any negotiation, anybody will tell you it's an opportunity to get something. And if you've got no cards to play, as the EFL generally hasn't, because its clubs are so weak, it is vulnerable and it gives more and more away. So the gap gets wider. It doesn't get narrower because it's more difficult. And with every negotiation, it gets wider. So as we've seen in recent negotiations, you end up with new rules on youth compensation. You have rules on academy teams coming into the EFL trophy. So it's little incremental steps that the EFL can't resist and its clubs can't resist, and that will go on and on. So these issues will only get wider. I think what is also important is that owners of clubs generally have made their money themselves. They see themselves as entrepreneurs, risk takers. It's their money. They are very resistant, full stop, to anybody coming and telling them how to spend their money. So if they want to tip it down a black hole, it's their money, they can. It's nothing to do with anybody else. So these cultural fundamental issues of behaviour and views of life in business are always going to overtake any issues about the greater good of the game, which is why I say individuals, it needs to be considered very differently. So that's how I see it. I don't see colossal amounts of clubs going bust because clubs find a way. I think there's enough good people in charge of the clubs to have financial probity, but we'll still get rogues, delinquents, as I call them, coming in, and they will see clubs as their own personal asset to do with what they will. And the fundamental problem that we all know in football is when they've gone, they can take the financial losses with them. Fine, I don't have a problem with that. But they leave the community losses behind for everybody else to pick up. And finding a way to protect the community losses and minimise those from the individual capital decisions is a really important one for me. So I think things like licensing, upfront bonds, things like that are really important. one of the biggest ways to sort this problem out is to stop bad people getting in the first place.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental point. That's not just about owners and directors tests. You've got to make the game look like it's not attractive to people who are opportunists. So you've got to make the game structurally and culturally not attractive to them. And whilst you can buy a football club for £1 to get its assets and take on the liabilities, and an owner will give it away, as happened at Bury with Stuart Day, he gave it to someone else to give the problem away. Whilst ever you can do that, and it's so easy to get in, you're going to have problems. Let's make it harder for people to get in. But again, fundamentally, if you're an existing owner, I can tell you any regulation that impacts the ability of someone to sell their club is a red line. It's a red line. So that isn't going to change by internal motivations. It has to come from outside. So that's how I see it going. More of the same, but it getting worse in the long term.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nigel. So much in there that resonates. Dave, I'm going to set you a challenge. 1 minute. And nothing happens. What happens?
I put in the comments the disenchantment of sport by economics continues apace. The entire pressure over the last 45 years is essentially to prioritise economics, profit maximisation, or indeed the sovereign control of a club by an individual. That is not going to go away unless there is a wider kind of mood in the land, because it does feel like we've gone past peak neoliberalism. It feels like that tide is receding. Maybe that will be to our advantage, but absent nothing happened, more will continue, which is essentially like Churchill said about appeasement. It's the idea that the crocodile eats you last. The big clubs are driving the Premier League drives the FA and the Premier League drives the Football League, that drives the non-league. Essentially, they're all hoping that they will be eaten last by the bastards, and eventually they will eat everybody. And then they'll go, oh, what happened to football? Might take 50 years, but that's the kind of end game if nothing happens, because they're too stupid to see the medium and longer term implications of their short term kind of this is good for me kind of behaviours.
Wonderful.
Might be a minute and a half.
You passed the test. Christina, on to you next. What happens if nothing happens?
We see more clubs go under, unfortunately. It's the simple answer. I've done quite a bit of work like Rob on financial sustainability, and it's a pretty grim picture. So and nobody really wants to see that on any level.
Okay, thank you very much. And the final word from David.
Well, I presume if nothing happens, eventually Saudi Arabia will be allowed to buy a Premier League club. You know, no doubt Kazakhstan. You know, and my God, isn't it the Russian state? Isn't it about time they actually had their own personal tribune? So I actually do expect, I mean, you know, sarcasm aside, I do expect more bad people and more politically motivated people to buy these institutions. And as Dave said, you know, 20, 30 years down the line, we're going to be saying, what happened to football?
Yeah. Okay. Right. Sean has come up with a subsequent question. Nigel, very quickly, I did say I was going to finish, but I think it's quite a pertinent question because we're talking about effective change. Do you think that the league and its clubs, or the clubs are the league effectively, would it accept an introduction of a club licensing system?
I was just trying to type the answer as you
sorry.
spoke to me. So I think it's an interesting one. The way I look at it is that the league already does it. That we've got a rule book that's this thick that imposes rules and regulations and requirements on what a club should be like and what good looks like. So that is already in place. The issues are around. Are those rules fit for purpose, and can they be made fit for purpose? And then this gets back to if the people who the rules are going to be made by are going to be judged on them, are they going to come up with different rules? It's like asking the criminals to create their own law book. I'm not sure. Does that work? So that's a problem. But we have the rules already in place. I think the other issue is, if you look at the EFL in particular, and same to an extent, the same with the Premier League, they have so many hats on that these conflict in their running of their institution. So there will be a rule maker driven by clubs, but they will advance what rules they think strategically are required. There will be a policeman looking for bad behaviour. There will be a prosecutor, and in the end, they may even be a judge in some cases, imposing penalties. So, is that a good governance structure when the people who make those rules are then are victims of them? I don't think that's a problem. But I think fundamentally clubs are used to regulation. It's just how it's framed and what those regulations are and what good looks like, which is the fundamental point, I think. What do we want clubs to be like? And we've touched on diversity, we've touched on environment, we've touched on governance, we've touched on financial probity and self-sustainability, all these kind of things. They're all the things that good directors, because I know football's taken a lot of stick, and probably people like me will take a lot of stick. They're what good directors sit and they talk about for their club. All these things. But it comes from within. Our issue is, if clubs don't have people like that sat at their table, and there's no guarantee that they will always be like that because of owners and directors and Steve Dales, all these kind of things that we've talked about, what protects the club then? Where does the guardian, who's the guardian at that point? And I think, so that I see a licensing system where maybe a regulator says, this is what good looks like. They come into regulatory standards, and then away you go, and you have got to live by them. And then the leagues come up with its detail, like it's doing with the Sheldon report on what good safeguarding is. So we do it all the time. So you get good safeguarding, and then an independent body reviews and benchmarks and maybe accredits clubs to kind of say, right, Carlisle United, you do great on fan engagement, you're not so good on the environment, you're good on, you might be not so good on governance, whatever it is, under these criteria, you're now a 3-star club. And then you get into things like special measures. So do we then intervene? So then it all kinds of cascades from that point of view. But that's a long, long way from where we are now. And that's the issue. We're miles away from anything like that.
Okay, I'm going to, first of all, thank the panel, Nigel, Christina, David and Dave. And I'm going to pass over back to Niall. So thanks everybody for your contributions, and I'm sorry I didn't get around to all the questions and comments.
Darren, thank you very much for chairing. So big thanks to Darren. That's been really insightful. Great session. Lots of food for thought. Now, just to stress that this is the start of a process. We're a little bit down there. But all these sort of issues we will be looking at, evaluating, and trying to get to the kind of best solutions that we possibly can and put the best options forward for fair game clubs to take part and actually push forward onto the agenda. That's what we're trying to do. So this afternoon will be the session where some of the clubs and the experts that we've got here will be looking together at some of these issues that have been raised this morning, and we will be trying to work out proper solutions for what those can be, those headline solutions. The next few weeks are, as I said, really exciting. So we do have our meeting with Alison McGovern on Friday. We've got the meeting with Tracy Crouch on Monday, where we'll be taking Fair Game's early findings to there, very much the headline stuff that we've been talking about. And then we'll be developing those, taking our experts and our clubs, bringing them together to finalise and develop proper policies, briefings, and more detailed solutions to some of the issues that are being raised here. So trying to take on board all those different elements so we can get something that's workable for the fair game clubs and actually radically changes football for the better and creates the vision that we've been trying to aim for. That's our ambition. I believe it's one that we can do. I've got to say a huge thank you to all the people that have come on board on this journey. We're beginning it. It's been great. And I do hope and I do believe that we've now got the momentum to actually deliver real proper change. And that's going to be our ultimate goal. And that's what we'll be pushing forward for the next few weeks and months ahead. So huge thank you to everybody. We've got a lunch break now. We'll be back here at 1:30. Apologies for overrunning slightly, but again, huge thank you to our panel. It's been great to have all your insights. And